The great hall of Tyrannus Prime stretched wide like the mouth of some ancient beast, and the 12 elder species of the Galactic Conclave sat in their towering seats above the floor, where the human delegation stood waiting for Judgment Ambassador. Kelveth of the Zorathi Dominion looked down at the small group of humans with eyes that held nothing but contempt, and his 4 arms crossed over his armored chest as he studied. These soft creatures who dared to ask for military alliance with the greatest powers in the galaxy, the Zorathi, were warriors born with natural armor that could stop plasma fire, and they had conquered 100 worlds before humans had even learned to make fire on their little blue planet. Beside Calveth sat the representative of the Mordai Collective, a being made of what looked like living stone with veins of glowing crystal running through its massive body. And the Mordai were famous across the galaxy for their ability to regenerate from almost any wound within minutes. The Vellani delegate floated in a sphere of psychic energy, its form shifting and changing as it read the thoughts of everyone in the room. And the Vellani had ended wars without firing a single shot, simply by reaching into the minds of their enemies and making them forget why they were fighting. These were the elder species, the powers that had ruled the galaxy for 10,000 years. And now they were being asked to accept humans as equals in matters of war. High Arbiter Thyssen rose from his central throne, his serpentine body coiling beneath robes of pure light as he called the assembly to order with a voice that echoed through the minds of all present. "We have reviewed the petition of the human species," Thyssen announced, and his tone carried the weight of absolute authority. "They wish to join the military coalition and receive access to weapons, technology, and warship designs." A ripple of amusement passed through the assembled species, and Calveth did not bother to hide his mocking laughter as he turned to face the other delegates. "Perhaps we should also give weapons to the grass grazers of my homeworld," he said loudly, enough for the humans to hear. "They would make equally effective soldiers." The Conclave's chief scientist, a being called Vrex, who belonged to a species that had evolved entirely for intellectual pursuits, activated the display system and began to show the results of their analysis of human biology. The humans possess no natural weapons, Rex explained as images of human anatomy appeared in the air above the chamber. No claws, no venomous glands, no armored hide, no psychic abilities whatsoever. The display showed a comparison between human bone density and that of other species, and the numbers made several delegates laugh openly at the weakness on display. "Human bones are primarily calcium-based and highly fragile," Rex continued. "A Zorathi child could crush a human skull with minimal effort, and their healing rate is measured in weeks rather than minutes." More data filled the air, showing reaction times and sensory capabilities and physical strength. And in every category, humans fell far below even the weakest species in the Conclave. "Perhaps most concerning," Rex said with what might have been pity in his voice, "humans require approximately 8 hours of complete unconsciousness every single day, a state during which they are entirely defenseless." Kelveth leaned forward in his seat and pointed one clawed finger at the human delegation below. 8 hours of helplessness every day," he announced to the chamber. "We call this the Little Death, and any species cursed with such a weakness has no place on a battlefield." The human delegation stood in silence through all of this, and their faces showed nothing as insult after insult was thrown at them from the beings. Above, Admiral Chen Weilin stood at the front of the human group, a woman of 60 years with gray streaking her black hair and scars on her hands that spoke of battles the Conclave knew nothing about. She had fought in 3 wars on Earth before humanity had ever reached the stars, and she had buried more friends than she could count. But her expression remained calm as the aliens mocked her species. High Arbiter Thyssen raised one hand to silence the chamber and delivered the official verdict that the Council had already decided before the humans had even arrived. The Galactic Conclave has reached a unanimous decision, he declared. Humanity is hereby classified as a Category 7 species, designated as negligible combat value. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and several of the alien delegates nodded with satisfaction at the judgment. Humans will be permitted to exist under Conclave protection, Thiessen continued, but they will not be granted warships or weapons technology of any kind, as such tools would be wasted on a species so poorly suited for warfare. Kelveth stood from his seat and looked directly at Admiral Chun with all four of his eyes. "You should be grateful," he said with a smile that showed rows of razor-sharp teeth. "The Conclave will protect you from the dangers of the galaxy, and in return you can serve us in administrative tasks. For you are soft creatures better suited to counting numbers than fighting battles." The other delegates murmured their agreement, and the matter seemed settled as far as every species in the room was concerned. Admiral Chun stepped forward, and her voice was steady when she spoke for the first time since the hearing had begun. "We understand your assessment," she said simply, and there was no anger in her words and no protest. And the judgment that had been passed Kale. Veth laughed again at what he saw as human submission to their natural place in the galaxy. "At least they know their weakness," he said to the Mordai delegate beside him. "Perhaps they are smarter than they appear." But the Mordai was looking at the human admiral with an expression that might have been curiosity, for the stone being had noticed something that Kelveth had missed entirely. There was no fear in the human's eyes, no shame at being called weak, no desperation to prove her species worthy of respect. There was only patience, the kind of patience that a predator shows when it knows that time is on its side. Admiral Chun turned and led her delegation out of the Great Hall, and not one of them looked back at the laughing aliens who had just declared humanity worthless. "Send our ship home," she told her aide as they walked through the corridors of the station. "And tell command that the Conclave responded exactly as we predicted they would." "And our response, Admiral?" The aide asked. Chun allowed herself a small smile that none of the Conclave's observers would ever see. "We wait," she said, "because sooner or later, something is going to come along that all their natural armor and regeneration and psychic powers cannot stop. And when that day comes, they will learn what humans have always known." "What is that, Admiral?" Chun looked out a viewport at the stars that stretched endlessly in all directions. Stars that humans had dreamed of reaching for thousands of years before they finally clawed their way off their planet. "The universe does not care how strong you are born," she said quietly. "It only cares if you are still standing when the fighting is done. And no species in this galaxy has more practice at refusing to die than we do." The human ship departed Tyrannus Prime that day, and the Conclave quickly forgot about the soft little creatures they had dismissed so easily. They would remember soon enough. 3 cycles passed after the humans were sent away from Tyrannus Prime, and the Galactic Conclave continued to rule the galaxy as they had for 10,000 years, confident that nothing in the universe could challenge their combined might. Then the Harvex came. They emerged from the darkness beyond the galactic rim like a tide of hunger given form, and their numbers were beyond anything the Conclave had ever seen or imagined possible. The Harvex were not a species in the way the Conclave understood the word, for they were a swarm, a hive mind of billions upon billions of creatures that shared one single thought across the void of space. That thought was simple and terrifying. Consume everything. Their bioships were living things grown from the flesh and bone of worlds they had already devoured, and they moved through space like a plague of locusts descending on a field of grain that does. First reports came from the outer colonies, distant worlds that most species had forgotten even existed, and the messages were all the same before they went silent. They are here. They are feeding. They cannot be stopped. System after system fell dark as the Harvex advanced, And the refugees who escaped told stories that made even the bravest warriors of the Zorathi feel cold fear in their hearts. The Harvex did not conquer. They did not negotiate. They did not take prisoners or demand surrender. They simply ate everything High Arbiter Thiessen called an emergency session of the Conclave. And for the first time in living memory, every species set aside their old grudges and rivalries to face a common enemy. We will crush this swarm as we have crushed every threat before, Kelveth declared as he reviewed the military assets being gathered. The combined fleet of the Conclave has never been defeated. The Zorathi deployed their legendary Sunbreaker fleet, ships armed with weapons that could crack planets in half, and shields that had never been broken in 10,000 years of warfare. The Mordai sent their shock troops by the millions, warriors who could regenerate from wounds that would kill any other species, soldiers who had never known the meaning of permanent death. The Villani contributed their psychic disruptor arrays, weapons that could reach into the minds of enemy commanders and turn their thoughts to chaos and confusion. It was the greatest military force ever assembled in galactic history, and every species was certain that the Harvex would break against their combined might like waves against a mountain. They were wrong. The two forces met at the Kethany Nebula, a region of space filled with swirling clouds of gas and dust that the Conclave strategists believed would limit the Harvex numbers and give them an advantage 6 hours later. The greatest military force in galactic history was running for its life. Goliath stood on the bridge of his command ship and watched in horror as the Zorathi flagship, a vessel that had led 100 victorious campaigns, was torn apart by Harvex biocruisers that sprayed acid through its shields and chewed through its hull. Fall back. He screamed into the communication system. All ships fall back. But there was nowhere to fall back to, for the Harvex were everywhere at once, their swarm tactics overwhelming the Conclave's careful battle formations with sheer endless numbers. The Mordai shock troops fought with incredible bravery on the stations and platforms that the Harvex had boarded, and they regenerated from terrible wounds again and again. But it did not matter. The Harvex simply ate them faster than they could heal Kael'theth, watched the feed from one station, and saw Mordai warriors being consumed alive, their regenerating flesh providing endless food for the swarm. Even as they screamed and tried to fight back, the Villani fared even worse. For when their psychics reached out to touch the Harvex collective mind, they found not one consciousness but trillions, a vast ocean of hunger and instinct that drowned their thoughts completely. The Villani delegate, who had sat so proudly at the Conclave hearing, was now curled into a ball on his ship, screaming without words as his mind was overwhelmed by the endless chorus of the swarm. "How many?" the delegate whispered over and over. "How many? How many? How many?" The retreat became a rout as ship after ship was lost, and the Conclave forces scattered in every direction, each vessel trying to escape on its own as the unified command structure collapsed. Entirely Caliph's ship barely escaped the nebula, and he watched through rear sensors as the Harvex consumed the remains of his once proud fleet without slowing down. In the weeks that followed, 17 systems fell to the swarm, and each one followed the same pattern. The Harvex would arrive in numbers too great to count. They would overwhelm all defenses through sheer mass, and then they would feed until nothing remained but dead worlds stripped of all life. The Conclave's War Council met in emergency session after emergency session, but every strategy they proposed failed, and every counterattack they launched was swallowed by the endless tide of the swarm. "We cannot stop them," Thiessen finally admitted in a voice that sounded older than his years. "At current rates of advance, they will reach the core worlds within 6 cycles. The chamber fell silent at these words, for the core worlds were the heart of galactic civilization, home to trillions of beings who had never known fear or want. Kael'theth slammed his fist against the table, his pride shattered by the defeats he had witnessed. "There must be something we can do," he demanded. Some weapon we have not tried. Some ally we have not called upon. Thiessen closed his eyes and took a long breath before speaking the words that burned his tongue like poison. There is one species we have not contacted, he said quietly. One that we dismissed as having negligible combat value. The chamber stirred as every delegate realized what Thiessen was suggesting. The humans? Kelveth asked with disbelief in his voice. What could those soft creatures possibly do against a threat that destroyed our combined forces? I do not know, Thiessen admitted, but we have tried everything else. And I would rather ask for help from those we mocked than watch our civilization be devoured. The message was sent to Earth that very day. A simple transmission asking for any assistance the humans could provide against the Harvex threat. Thiessen swallowed his pride and tried to make the request sound reasonable, tried to hide the desperation behind his words. But he knew the humans would hear it anyway. Admiral Chun received the transmission in her office at Earth Defense Command, and she read it 3 times before allowing herself to smile. What is our response, Admiral? Her aide asked, just as he had 3 cycles ago when they left Tyrannus. Prime Chun stood and walked to the window that looked out over the shipyards where the human fleet waited. Ships that the Conclave had never seen and knew nothing about. Tell them we have been waiting, she said, and asked them to send us the coordinates of the main Harvex High Fleet. The aide hesitated for a moment before asking the question that was on everyone's mind. Admiral, the Conclave's combined forces were destroyed by the Harvex, and our fleet is much smaller than theirs was. So how can we hope to succeed where they failed? Chun turned to face her aide with eyes that held the weight of human history in their depths. Because we are not going to fight the way they did, she answered. The Conclave sent their strongest warriors to meet the Harvex in honorable battle. And they lost because they fought the way they have always fought. And how will we fight? Admiral Chun looked back out the window at her waiting fleet and thought about all the wars humanity had survived, all the enemies they had faced, all the times the universe had tried to kill them and failed, the way humans have always fought, she said softly. Dirty, desperate, and absolutely unwilling to stop until one side is dead. And I promise you, it will not be us. The human fleet launched 3 days later, and as they departed Earth, every soldier on every ship knew they were flying toward a battle that might be the end of their species. They went anyway. The human carrier Indomitable moved through space toward the Thesser system where the main Harvex High Fleet had gathered, and aboard the massive ship, observers from the Galactic Conclave watched the humans prepare for a battle that seemed impossible to Winkelife, had been sent by High Arbiter Thiessen to witness the human response firsthand. And the Zarathi warrior could not understand what he was seeing. The human fleet was small, barely 300 vessels compared to the millions of Harvex bioships that their sensors showed waiting in the system, ahead by every calculation the Conclave had made. The humans were flying to their deaths, and yet they showed no fear. No hesitation, no signs of the terror that should have filled any rational being facing such odds. Kale Veth walked through the corridors of the Indomitable and watched the human soldiers going about their preparations with calm efficiency that bordered on the disturbing. A group of young soldiers sat together in a mess hall, and they were laughing as they ate what might be their last meal. How can you find humor in this moment? Kelveth demanded as he approached their table. You are about to face an enemy that destroyed the combined might of the Galactic Conclave. And you sit here laughing like children at play. One of the soldiers, a sergeant with dark skin and gray at his temples, looked up at the towering alien without any sign of intimidation in his eyes. Would you prefer we sit here crying, counselor? The sergeant asked with a slight smile. That would not change what we are about to do. And besides, I have a good joke about a Harvex walking into a bar that I might not get another chance to tell. Kelveth stared at the human as if he were looking at an entirely new species. You are insane. he said slowly. All of you are insane. The sergeant shrugged and took another bite of his food before responding. Maybe we are, he admitted. But let me ask you something, counselor. What do you think happens when a species like ours evolves on a planet that is constantly trying to kill them? Calveth did not understand the question, and his confusion must have shown on his face. Our world is filled with predators and poisons and diseases. The sergeant continued. We spent 1,000,000 years fighting things with bigger teeth and sharper claws and stronger bodies than ours. And we survived by being too stubborn to know when we were supposed to die. He gestured at the other soldiers around him. Young men and women who were checking their weapons and saying goodbye to loved ones through recorded messages they might never be able to send. Every single one of us comes from a long line of survivors. The sergeant said, people who faced impossible odds and refused to give up. People who looked death in the face and said, not today. Calveth thought about the Zorathy way of war, where battles were won through superior strength and armor and firepower, where weakness was simply eliminated from the bloodline through natural selection. Humans had no natural weapons, no armor, no advantages at all in direct combat. And yet they had somehow become the dominant species on their planet. How? Calveth asked quietly. How did creatures like you survive at all? The sergeant smiled again, but this time there was something cold behind his eyes. Because we learned something a long time ago, he said. We learned that fighting is not about who is stronger. It is about who wants it more, who is willing to pay the higher price, who will keep getting up no matter how many times they get knocked down. He leaned forward and met the alien's gaze directly. The Harvex have numbers and natural weapons, and a hive mind that coordinates millions of units perfectly, the sergeant continued. But they have never faced anything like us, because they have never faced a species that simply refuses to accept defeat. Calveth wanted to argue, wanted to point out how foolish this sounded against an enemy that had devoured 17 civilizations. But something in the human's voice made him hesitate. The ship's communication system crackled to life, and Admiral Chun's voice filled every corridor and cabin on the Indomitable. All hands. This is Admiral Chun, she said in a tone that was calm but carried absolute authority. We will enter the Desert system in 6 hours. And I want every one of you to understand exactly what we are doing and why. The soldiers in the mess hall fell silent, and Calveth watched as every human stopped what they were doing to listen. The Galactic Conclave called us weak. Chun continued. They looked at our bodies and saw no natural armor, no claws, no venom. And they decided that meant we had nothing to offer in a fight. A murmur of agreement passed through the human soldiers, though Calveth could not tell if it was anger or amusement in their voices. They never understood what weakness really is. The Admiral said, weakness is not about what you are born with. Weakness is about what you do when everything goes wrong. And humans have never been weak by that measure. Chum paused before continuing. And when she spoke again, her voice had hardened into steel. Our ancestors faced ice ages and plagues and predators that should have wiped us out 1,000 times over, she said. They faced each other in wars that killed millions. And still they kept going. Still they rebuilt. Still they refused to let anything end them. The Harvex think they understand war, Chun declared. They understand consumption and overwhelming force and the mathematics of superior numbers. But they do not understand us. Calveth felt something strange stirring in his chest as he listened to the human admiral speak. They do not understand that we chose to be dangerous, Chun said. They do not understand that every weapon we carry, every ship we fly, every strategy we use was created by a species that knew it had no natural advantages and decided to build them instead. The Admiral's voice rose with fierce pride as she delivered her final words. Today, we show the Harvex what happens when they face a species that has spent its entire existence fighting against. Impossible odds, she said. Today we show them what humans are really made of, and when this battle is over, they will understand that calling us weak was the biggest mistake they ever made. The communication ended, and silence filled the mess hall for a long moment. Then the sergeant stood up from his table and began checking his weapon with the same calm efficiency that Kelveth had found so disturbing. Just minutes ago, you should find somewhere safe to observe. Counselor, the sergeant said without looking up. Things are about to get very loud. Kelveth returned to the observation deck where the other conclave representatives had gathered, and none of them spoke as the human fleet drew closer to the Harvex swarm. They did not understand what they were about to witness. They did not understand that the species they had called weak was about to teach the galaxy a lesson it would never forget. The humans were not just going to fight the Harvex, they were going to show every species in the galaxy what it meant to refuse to die. The Battle of Thesser began when the human fleet emerged from hyperspace directly in the center of the Harvex swarm. A maneuver so reckless that Kelveth nearly collapsed when he saw it happen. Every tactical doctrine in the galaxy said that you never jumped into the middle of an enemy formation, that you attacked from the edges and worked your way in, that you preserved your forces and fought with strategy and intelligence. The humans did none of these things. They appeared in a flash of light, surrounded on all sides by millions of Harvex bioships. And before the swarm could even react, the human fleet opened fire in every direction at once. The first hour of the battle was pure chaos, and Kelveth watched from the observation deck of the Indomitable as human ships tore through the Harvex formation like angry insects, never staying still, never fighting the same way twice. The Harvex responded with their usual tactics, trying to overwhelm the human ships with numbers and consume them the way they had consumed the Conclave fleet. But the humans would not cooperate when Harvex bioships tried to swarm a human vessel. The humans would accelerate directly toward them and detonate mines they had scattered behind them, destroying the pursuing enemies at the cost of damage to their own ships. When Harvex boarding parties tried to attach to human hulls, they found the corridors filled with traps and ambushes and soldiers who fought with a ferocity that made no tactical sense. Kelveth watched a feed from one of the boarded ships and saw human soldiers holding a corridor against a wave of Harvex drones. And when their ammunition ran out, they drew knives and kept fighting. Why do they not retreat? He asked no one in particular. The corridor is lost. They should fall back to a more defensible position. The Villani observer beside him turned with eyes that held a mix of horror and fascination. I touched their minds, the Villani whispered. Just for a moment, just to understand what they were feeling. And what did you find? The Villani shuddered before answering. Rage, it said quietly. Such rage, ancient and terrible, born from 1,000,000 years of refusing to be prey. And they are not fighting to win the battle. They are fighting to make the Harvex pay for every inch of ground and blood. The battle raged for 6 hours, then 8, then 10. And throughout it all, the communications from the combat zone became increasingly fragmented and desperate. Then they stopped entirely. For 12 hours, no transmissions escaped the Thesser system, and the observation posts on the systems edge detected only the signatures of weapons fire and the death screams of ships, both human and Harvex. Keith paced the observation deck and wondered if the humans had simply been destroyed, if their mad courage had finally met its limit against the endless hunger of the swarm. Then a transmission burst through on every channel, and it carried visual data from the surface of Thesser 4, where the Harvex had deployed their ground forces. What Kelveth saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. The humans were fighting in conditions that should have killed them hours ago, with temperatures far beyond what their fragile bodies could tolerate an atmosphere thick with the toxic spores the Harvex used to. Weakened defenders before an assault, but they were still fighting a human private with both legs crushed. Beneath fallen debris was dragging herself toward a Harvex warrior with a thermal charge clutched in one hand. And she was smiling as she pulled the trigger. A squad of human soldiers, cut off from any hope of rescue and surrounded by thousands of Harvex drones, had charged directly into the enemy mass rather than wait to be overwhelmed. The video showed them screaming a battle cry as they ran. And then the tunnel collapsed on top of all of them, because they had rigged the supports to blow. Insanity, Kelveth whispered as he watched. This is not warfare, this is suicide. But even as he said the words, he knew they were not quite right. The humans were not dying for nothing. They were dying to take as many Harvex with them as possible. To make every meter of ground cost the swarm dearly. To turn their weakness into a weapon by refusing to accept the death that should have been inevitable. Another feed showed a human sniper who had been firing from a ruined building for 3 days without sleep. Her body running on nothing but stimulants and hate. Her ammunition had run out 12 hours ago. But she was still there, still fighting, using the bodies of dead Harvex as barriers and weapons when she had nothing else. A Harvex drone finally reached her position, and she killed it with a piece of broken glass before it could consume her. Then another drone came, and another, and she killed them too. Until finally one got close enough to bite. The camera showed her face as the Harvex venom began to shut down her nervous system. And there was no fear in her eyes, only satisfaction. 16 confirmed kills with no ammunition, she said to no one. And then she smiled and stopped moving. The feeds continued to show more scenes like this across every front where humans and Harvex were engaged. A pilot whose ship had been crippled setting a collision course for a Harvex carrier and riding it all the way down. A medic who stayed behind to protect wounded soldiers when evacuation became impossible. Fighting with surgical tools when her sidearm ran empty. A commander who called in an orbital strike on his own position rather than let his soldiers be taken alive by the swarm. They do not retreat, the Mordai observer said with something like awe in his voice. I have never seen a species that simply does not retreat. Kelveth shook his head slowly as he watched more humans die fighting with a determination that defied everything he knew about survival instincts. They are not refusing to retreat, he said quietly. They are refusing to lose, even if the cost of not losing is everything they have. The battle raged on through the night and into another day, and the human losses mounted to levels that would have broken any other species in the galaxy. 60% of their ships were destroyed or crippled beyond repair. 70% of their ground forces were killed or wounded so badly they could no longer fight, and still they refused to stop. The Harvex had never encountered anything like this, had never faced an enemy that would not break no matter how much damage they inflicted. The swarm was learning something new, something that their collective mind had never needed to understand before. They were learning what it meant to fight humans, and they were learning to be afraid. The Harvex Queen Mind had existed for 10,000 years, and in all that time she had consumed the consciousness of 400 species as her swarm devoured their worlds. She knew what prey felt like when they died, had tasted the unique flavor of each species as they fell before her children. The Zorathi tasted of bitter pride, turning to despair as their strength proved meaningless against numbers beyond counting. The Mordai tasted of cold frustration as their regeneration failed to save them from being eaten faster than they could heal. The Vellani tasted of screaming terror as their psychic minds drowned in the endless ocean of the swarm's collective consciousness. All prey, in the end, tasted the same: resignation, acceptance, the understanding that they were simply food for something greater than themselves. The Humans tasted wrong. The Queen Mind had reached out to touch the minds of the human soldiers fighting on HFY, expecting to find the familiar flavor of creatures accepting their place in the natural order. Instead, she found something that burned. There was no resignation in the humans, no acceptance, no understanding that they should stop fighting and let the end come peacefully. There was only rage. It was not the hot anger of a cornered animal lashing out in fear, not the desperate fury of creatures who thought they might still escape it. It was something older and deeper and far more terrible. A cold, burning hatred that had been forged over millions of years of fighting against a universe that wanted them dead. Every human soldier the Queen Mind touched filled her collective consciousness with the same overwhelming message, repeated over and over like a war drum beating in the darkness. We will make you pay for every inch. The Queen Mind tried to understand this new sensation, tried to analyze what made humans so different from every other species she had consumed. She reached deeper into their minds and found memories of ice ages that had nearly frozen them to extinction, of plagues that had killed half their population, of predators that should have hunted them out of existence. She found memories of wars fought against each other, conflicts so terrible that they had nearly destroyed their own civilization multiple times, and through all of it, through every disaster and catastrophe and near extinction event, she found the same stubborn refusal to accept defeat. Humans had survived, not because they were stronger or faster or smarter than the things that tried to kill them. They had survived because they simply would not stop. The Queen Mind felt something stir in her ancient consciousness, an emotion she had never experienced in all her 10,000 years of existence. It took her a moment to recognize it as fear. Her children were dying by the millions, and not in the clean, efficient way that prey usually died when overwhelmed by the swarm. They were dying in explosions and collapses and traps, taken down by humans who sacrificed themselves just to kill a few more drones before the end. The mathematics of the battle no longer made sense, because humans were not fighting according to any mathematics. The Queen Mind understood a human destroyer, crippled and burning and with most of its crew already dead, suddenly changed course and accelerated directly toward her queenship. Queen Mind reached out to touch the mind of the captain and found a woman named Sarah Park, who had already lost her husband and 2 children to the Harvex invasion of the outer colonies. There was no fear in Captain Park's mind as her ship built up to faster than light speeds on a collision course with the greatest bioship in the swarm. There was only one thought, clear and bright and terrible. This is for them. The queenship, home of the Harvex collective consciousness for 100 centuries, was destroyed in a flash of light that lit up the entire system. And when the Queen Mind died, the swarm died with hers. The Harvex were not individuals, could not function without the central consciousness that coordinated their every action. And when that consciousness was torn apart by a human destroyer moving at impossible speeds, every drone in the galaxy simply stopped on this HFY. The human soldiers who were still fighting suddenly found themselves surrounded by enemies that had frozen in place like statues on ships across the system. Harvex boarding parties collapsed where they stood as the connection to their hive mind was severed forever. Admiral Chun stood on the bridge of the Indomitable, her arm in a makeshift sling and burns covering half her face from when the ship had nearly been destroyed 6 hours ago. The main view screen showed the debris field where the Harvex armada had been, and the distant glow of the Queen ship's death still lingered like a second sun. Admiral, her communications officer said in a voice that trembled with exhaustion and disbelief, "We are receiving transmissions from across the rim. The entire Harvex swarm is in collapse. Every drone, every bioship, everything has just stopped." Chun nodded slowly, not trusting herself to speak for a moment. The silence on the bridge was broken by the crackle of an incoming transmission from High Arbiter Thiessen. "Admiral Chun," the alien's voice said, And there was something in it that had not been there when he had declared humanity a Category 7 species. The HFYs are gone, all of them. We are receiving reports from every system they had invaded. How did you do this? Chun looked at the field of human dead floating among the alien wreckage. Sons and daughters and friends who would never go home. You classified us as weak. Arbiter, she said quietly. You saw our soft skin and our slow reflexes and our need for sleep. And you measured everything about us except the one thing that mattered. And what is that? Chun turned to face the view screen, where the first Conclave relief ships were arriving far too late to make any difference at all. Humans do not know how to quit, she said. The HFYs could have killed every single one of us, but they could never make us stop fighting, and in the end that was all that mattered. The channel fell silent as Thiessen processed her words across the galaxy. The Conclave's war rooms went quiet as reports continued to come in from every front. The species they had dismissed, the creatures they had called weak. The soft, fragile, impossible humans had done what 12 elder species could not, and they had done it alone 1 year later. The Galactic Conclave voted unanimously to reclassify humanity with a designation that had never existed before in their 10,000-year history. Category 0. Apex Persistence Predator. Do not engage under any circumstances when asked for comment. At the ceremony where the new classification was announced, Admiral Chun stood before the same council that had mocked her species and spoke words that would be remembered for generations. We are not the strongest, she said. We are not the fastest, and we are probably not the smartest species in this galaxy. She paused and looked at each of the alien delegates who had once laughed at the idea of humans in combat. But we are the ones who are still standing when the dust settles. She continued, we always have been, and we always will be. The delegates had no response. For what could they say to a species that had just proven itself willing to die to the last soldier rather than accept defeat? Calveth, who had witnessed the entire battle from beginning to end, rose from his seat and did something no Zorathi had ever done for any other species. He bowed. We were fools, he said simply, and we are grateful that you were willing to save us despite our foolishness. Admiral Chun nodded and allowed herself a small smile. Just remember, Counselor, she said, the next time someone tells you that a species is weak because they have no natural weapons or armor, ask yourself one question. What question? Chun's smile grew wider, and for just a moment Kelveth saw the same cold fire in her eyes that had burned in every human soldier he had watched die fighting the HFYs. Ask yourself what that species had to become to survive without those things, she said, because the answer might terrify you. The chamber fell silent once more, and every delegate in the room understood that the galaxy had changed forever. The humans had not just defeated the HFYs, they had shown the universe what it meant to be truly dangerous, and nobody would ever call them weak again.